well. If not, as you can see on your screen, there is really a connection where you can, under point 3, where by clicking there, you can really link to YouTube, where this webinar is live streamed to YouTube. So if you're having an audio problem, usually through the YouTube live streaming, the audio connection is a lot better. I'd like also to let you know that this webinar is recorded and it will be made available in the coming days on the state website. So if any of your colleagues, for whatever reason, are not able to attend to this one, you can refer to them to listen to it afterwards. We also, at the end of the webinar, we share a summary of the key points with the key reflections of the speakers, and also we would circulate, including the PowerPoint presentation that you'll be seeing through, together with some background documents that could be helpful for your work as you take over, hopefully, some lessons or some key practical points out of this webinar. So today's webinar is really going to focus on the role that senior leadership in field operations, and in particular, humanitarian coordinators and members of the humanitarian country team can take in order to ensure that the protection is at the heart of the humanitarian response. Often when we go out operations, the question comes that we often ask is, but what exactly is the role of the humanitarian coordinator in terms of protection? How does it differ from the role of the protection cluster or the UNHCR representative or the UNICEF? To answer to these questions, I have today with me two distinguished colleagues, and I've requested them to give us their practical examples, their practical point of view in terms of how to take protection and really apply it in today's operations, where often they're complex and really there isn't an easy answer to many of the challenges that we're facing in these operations. So the focus of today's discussion is primarily on the leadership angle on protection and how to operationalize it, what's the link with the various actors, and how can we move forward while working in a very, very challenging environment. To answer to these questions, I have two distinguished colleagues who are going to provide their reflections and thoughts. I'd like to introduce Volker Turk, who is the Assistant High Commissioner Protection at the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. He's joining us in this conversation from Geneva. So Volker, a warm welcome, and we're really delighted to have you with us in this extremely important conversation. I'd like to also invite Eugene Ousu, who is the Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General in Southern Sudan. He's also the Resident Coordinator and Humanitarian Coordinator, working in really what is one of the most challenging protection environments based out of Juba. And Eugene, you're also really welcome and wonderful to have you with us. We'll be hearing Eugene's thoughts from Juba as we go through. So with this introduction, I'd like to move to the first question. And Volker, I'd like to ask you, why is leadership on protection so important? What is it that humanitarian coordinators or UN reps or NGO country directors, members of the humanitarian country team can put in place in a practical way in order to address these challenging issues? Many people often say, but isn't this the job of the protection cluster? Volker, over to you.
Thank you very much, Panos. It's a great opportunity to engage with all of you on what is actually the essence of humanitarian operations, which, as you know, is protection. It concerns us all. It's not something that just falls on the protection experts or on the protection cluster. It is an issue of collective responsibility for all humanitarian actors, and in particular for the humanitarian coordinators and for UN humanitarian country teams. But what does protection mean concretely? I think the fundamental orientation of any humanitarian action has to be towards people. People who are affected by conflict, who are affected by natural disasters, who are affected by displacement. we've often talked about participatory assessments, for example, and to instill a strong age, gender, and diversity lens in our action, and that is an important element. It's this sense of accountability towards people that are affected by complex humanitarian emergencies. Of course, through this, we are able to understand better the needs, the risks that people face, the vulnerabilities. We also understand better the rights that people have and they want to exercise, including why they are in a conflict situation, in a disaster situation, and who are the actors behind that. So it's important to also bear in mind that obviously humanitarian action is guided by fundamental humanitarian principles of humanity, of dignity, of impartiality, neutrality, and independence, the do not harm principle that we often talk about, but it has to be operationalized in each and every humanitarian action that we take. And of course, it is informed by fundamental principles of international law. So in essence, protection means three things. It's that the overall direction of a humanitarian operation needs to be guided by protection. It means that in the delivery of humanitarian assistance, we need to put a particular emphasis on analyzing what impact it has on marginalized groups, on vulnerable people, on those with specific needs. It also means concrete protection services, ensuring that families are not separated, certain child protection activities, SGBV, the registration and documentation. And in a way, which means concrete protection services, in a way, this is shown in this protection pyramid that you have in front of your screen, because you see that the protection cluster does the nuts and bolts of protection services, coordination, doing the analysis, identifying the issues, and this needs to obviously feed into what the other clusters are doing when they deliver humanitarian assistance. This analysis has to feed into this. And we see this, for instance, when they draft humanitarian response plans. Iraq is a good example. The humanitarian response plan in Iraq has identified in each and every cluster a protection objective. The overall analysis is a protection-based one. And this leads me to the next point, which is this inter-cluster coordination, because you will see that protection mainstreaming means precisely this. It means we look at the delivery of shelter, of water and sanitation, of non-food items from a protection perspective. We see how it impacts on people, how it affects their lives, whether there's a different angle to it from a gender perspective or from a child protection perspective. And again, if I give you an example, the Yemen the Humanitarian Country Team strategy actually put together the protection and the gender lens, which is important because it tried precisely to ensure that in the humanitarian activities that are happening on a daily basis, that it is informed by protection, it's informed by a gender analysis. And then this leads me to the last point, the Humanitarian Country Teams. There it's clear there will be in each and every operation 1, 2, 3 critical issues that will need to be addressed at the level of the humanitarian country team, at the level of the humanitarian coordinator, and their leadership will be absolutely necessary. And this is actually what the centrality of protection is about, because these are issues that cannot fall just on the protection cluster. They will have to be addressed by all humanitarian actors together. If you like, that's what I think would be good to discuss a little bit further.
Thank you, Volker. Indeed, guided by the principles, but also looking at the pyramid, it's obvious, it's clear that protection really is everybody's responsibility, and in particular, the responsibility of the humanitarian field leaders in terms of how to take difficult protection issues, how to best address them. What I heard you also talk is about the collective action that is needed on the ground. So, Volker, if I can come back to you and ask you the question that I've heard often in the field, which is, what are your top tips, I would say, that you would give to humanitarian coordinators in terms of how to operationalize protection? What are the steps that they could follow to, in a way, demystify it? Because often it is seen as a complicated, possibly too technical, too sensitive, or too difficult to bring over in an operational way. Volker, over to you.
Thank you, Panos. I think, first of all, it is important not to be afraid of protection, to see it as something that we all can work together and that we can own together, especially when it comes to the most sensitive and most complex issues. So if I had a humanitarian coordinator in front of me, what would be my advice? I would say, first of all, it is important that protection is a standing item at each and every UN country team meeting. I think that is where it starts. And I must say, in all the field missions that I've undertaken over the last 2 years, in most humanitarian country team meetings, that is the case. I mean, there are some good examples. Iraq, for instance, where the humanitarian coordinator has asked the protection cluster every 2 weeks to come up with a critical protection issues note. 2 pages, not longer than that. And that, I think, is good practice. The second point, I think the humanitarian coordinator has to use the protection cluster, providing the analysis, asking them for guidance, for options when difficult issues arise, such as, for example, in the context of humanitarian evacuations. I mean, we had one example in the Central African Republic where 2 years ago, when a community was particularly entrapped, and there was a very serious issue of life and death for that community, and they could have been attacked. What do they suggest we do? And the protection cluster developed a monitoring system, hotspots, and actually a very concrete response. They suggested humanitarian evacuation. But it was not for the protection cluster to address this. It was really for the UN country team to do it with the leadership of the humanitarian coordinator. And I think that's what is important. The third one, I think it's important that the humanitarian coordinators also use the UNHCR representative, for example, some key heads of agencies within the UN country team, some of the key NGO counterparts, and ask them, when a particularly difficult issue arises, what is their suggestion? What are their options? So that this can then be brought into a discussion within the broader team. The fourth one, it is really key that there is an oversight exercised by the UN country team and by the humanitarian coordinator when it comes to mainstreaming. So that we do not wake up and discover that sexual violence was an issue in too many settlements in the country, that we make sure that child protection is not ignored. So there needs to be that type of oversight that can be exercised through meetings with UN country teams, but also in the way that the humanitarian appeal is drafted and funded, and how the funding is also delivered for protection services. The fifth point, I think it's really key that humanitarian country teams come together and develop a protection strategy on the most critical protection issues that they face. And it may only be one in a particular country, it may be 2 or 3, but it is beyond the protection cluster. Of course, the protection cluster informs and helps in the development of this, but it has to be owned by the humanitarian country team as a whole, because we do need to ensure that there is a coherence of analysis and a coherence of response. And then that leads me to the last point. It's then upon the leadership of the humanitarian coordinator to say, in terms of how we address these issues, we're going to have a division of labor among the country team, and some may be placed better than others to make some interventions. There may have to be a military-civilian coordination unit, for example, that addresses some of those issues. We know in a lot of integrated missions with the triple or triple hatting or even quadruple hatting sometimes of HCs, this is actually possible. So there are a lot of ways and means to intervene once the critical issues have been identified and once we have come up with some of the responses. Thank you, Panos.
Thanks, Volker. It's really helpful to see the steps, but I would also call the logic of the step. It's refreshing to also hear that what you're advocating is really not rewriting, if you want, a long human rights or legal document, but you're talking about a couple of pages to be able to come with one or two or three maybe protection priorities that is updated. But also it's clear to hear the distinction between the very important foundation, as you said, role of the protection cluster, and then seeing from that how one could extrapolate the one or two issues that the HCT will then address them from a leadership perspective, because it's indeed the humanitarian coordinator or the senior leaders of the UN or NGOs that have these high-level meetings or behind-scene meetings or with ambassadors or friendly countries. So that's really clear to see these steps that really go, but also the oversight role, the how to take the protection vulnerabilities and go through each cluster and operationalize it in a practical way, the mainstreaming part, which you've described. Before I take us all to Juba, I'd like to remind everybody that and encourage you to send us questions. In the next few minutes, I will be taking questions from all of you and asking our two speakers. I want to remind everybody who's joined and welcome everybody who's joined on the questions and answers top right-hand side button. If you click there, you can send a question, but also I want to encourage you to participate in the chat and really not to encourage you to share thoughts, reflections between all of you. I'm encouraged to see so many of you who have joined us live on this conversation. I'd like to take us all now to Juba, where Eugene Owusu, the DSRSG, Resident Coordinator, Humanitarian Coordinator for South Sudan, is there to also share his reflections. Eugene, South Sudan really tops the list of countries with quite a difficult, complex operation situation, and really many call it a protection crisis. So I'd like to ask you, as a humanitarian coordinator, what concrete practical steps you have taken in order really to bring protection at the heart of the humanitarian operation, at the response, at the HCT response, and to ensure that we're doing everything possible while operating in quite a challenging environment. So, Eugene, very welcome, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Panos, and many thanks to you and the team for the opportunity that you've provided for us to share our experiences here in South Sudan with our global constituency. I will start with a couple of words on context to set a backdrop for the specific experiences that indeed I will be sharing. Panos, as you rightly said, South Sudan is a complex political and security context. And the scale of the humanitarian challenge that we are dealing with here is monumental. And as if that is not enough, the operating environment is extremely difficult and, I should say, rather non-permissive. South Sudan presently is one of the most challenging protection contexts in the world. We have 3 million people displaced, serious abuses, rampant sexual and gender-based violence, forced recruitment of children, and a pervasive, what we do is this is a context that is awash with pervasive impunity. South Sudan also hosts one of the largest integrated missions in this world, and this mission, the UN mission in South Sudan, has the protection of civilians as a core pillar in its mandate. So what are some of the practical things that indeed we've done, given the context in which our work takes place, to really place protection at the center of our work? We've taken multiple actions. We've taken multiple steps to ensure that protection is front and center of our humanitarian operations here. And I'll break down what we've done into 3 broad sets of actions, 3 broad categories. The first is strategic reflections and joint actions in relation to protection. The second is advocacy. And the third is funding. On the first, strategic reflections and joint actions. At the strategic level, and again, just to buttress what Volker has said, here in South Sudan, we do have a protection strategy, which acts as the hook, or if you like, the anchor for all our protection work. And we have incorporated protection as a key component of our humanitarian response plan. For instance, for our current response plan, in 2016, we mainstream protection in our two strategic objectives. But based on lessons learned from this year, going forward to 2017, we have decided to make protection a specific objective in our humanitarian response plan. We've done so because we have come to the conclusion that South Sudan is first and foremost a protection crisis. But that said, panels, let me just say here that the development of a strategy is one thing, and as the famous English saying goes, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Development of the strategy is one thing, but it's all about implementation. So developing a strategy or formulating a strategic objective is only as meaningful and as good as its implementation. And so practically, what are the things that we've done here in South Sudan to make a difference where protection is concerned? And I'll share a few examples. First, as a humanitarian country team, we have dedicated time to discuss specific protection issues, specific context, specific protection risk, and we have collectively identified steps to address these risks. I'll give you an example. In 2015, amidst all the multiple challenges that we had to deal with here in South Sudan, we did make a strategic choice as a humanitarian country team to prioritize protection needs in the Central and Southern Unity, which is a region within South Sudan, and we did so because of our analysis of the scale and intensity of the protection challenge that we did face, the horrendous atrocities which were taking place in Southern and Central Unity. So we made Southern and Central Unity a standing agenda item in all our humanitarian country team conversations, and building on information and analysis which a very solid protection cluster compiled for us. We discussed how, for instance, we could influence decision-making at the level of the UN mission regarding deployment of troops and assets to the area. And I'm pleased to mention that our strong advocacy and engagement resulted in the establishment of a temporary operating base which had about one company of troops in Southern and Central Unity. And here I also want to flag that my triple-hearted role became very, very handy in that engagement. This year we are grappling with a similar situation where in the greater Equatorial region we have huge protection challenges. And just as we did last year, we had made Greater Equatoria a standing agenda item in humanitarian country team discussions, especially since violence escalated in July 2016. We've used this agenda to discuss key asks of the mission, and here again I'm pleased to share with the colleagues that as a consequence of our engagement, collective engagement, the mission now undertakes enhanced long-distance patrols to year in Greater Equatoria, where we believe the protection risk is indeed highest. And we've also used the same platform to identify common messages to support our advocacy when it comes to the protection crisis that we do have in Greater Equatoria region. Second, on advocacy, I wish to here mention the centrality of public and private advocacy in our protection work. And I just would like to underline that I personally strongly believe that the combination of these two approaches is absolutely critical to achieve results. Take, for example, in July when the crisis broke out here in Juba. Civilians clearly bore the brunt of the fighting, and they suffered tremendously during the chaotic aftermath. At that time, we, the country team, engaged on multiple levels and with multiple actors in an endeavor to protect civilians and ensure that we could also reach those who needed assistance. Practically, what did we do then? I issued a public statement on behalf of the Humanitarian Country Team in July this year to condemn the fighting, as well as a written demarche which was shared in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And I also engaged in conversations with all parties and urged them to uphold the obligations under IHR. I have to say here that whilst we were probably not able to prevent much of the horrific violations, we were, I believe, able to expose them and to increase international pressure for an immediate end to hostilities. And here, and this is important, I want to mention that our work was supported greatly and extensively by the protection cluster, our advocacy work. It was the protection cluster that provided the information that we needed to inform our engagement at the highest level. We also did reach out to other, particularly high-level mandate holders within the UN to raise the profile of the protection crisis here in South Sudan. And special mention is made of our engagement with SRSG on sexual violence in conflict. On advocacy, let me conclude by saying that we all agree that we need to speak truth to power. But I would like to say here that it is all about getting results. It's not just about saying things that will make us feel good about ourselves. It is about smart advocacy. So timing, tone, messaging, packaging of messaging, absolutely important. And so is the choice of interlocutors when it comes to private advocacy. And I'll admit that in this difficult context here in South Sudan, we've not always been successful with our advocacy. And we've not always gotten the desired results. But we are committed to continue to push the envelope. We can't afford to give up. We have to be relentless, and we have to persevere. Finally, on funding, an important action that I've taken has been to provide protection partners with resources through the Common Humanitarian Fund. Although the protection cluster, as all of us do know, often is the lowest funded cluster. Working with our advisory board, I've been able to take decisions that has really led to the allocation of funding for protection partners at critical moments in our response, such as support to clinical management of rape in a region, in WOW, which is in the northwestern part of the country, following the fighting in February and June. Presently, we are in the process of funding dignity kits and child-friendly spaces for our response in the greater Equatoria. So while allocation from CHF typically are modest, I really want to flag an important utility in doing this, which is that they help to signify to bilateral donors that protection is truly a priority in our response, and that it should be fully funded. And here again, we really leverage the strong work done by the protection cluster, which brings to the table excellent information, the analysis, and prioritization of activities. This has been crucial, as it has enabled us to increase funding to protection with the confidence that there will be strong results to show. I'd like to conclude, panels, by here quickly just mentioning, based on my experience, the role of the HC on protection issues. I'd like to mention three things that I think are critical. The first is that the HC, the HCT, and HCT members must be willing to step up and show leadership on protection. It is not just the responsibility of the protection cluster leads. It is a responsibility for all of us. Secondly, in order for the HC and the HCT to step up, we need to have good information and clear priorities to focus our engagement on. This is where the importance of an empowered and strong protection cluster comes in. I mean, look, let me just share this with you. Invariably, in all cases, and certainly here in South Sudan, you raise the issues with government, and their first question is, show us the evidence. And this is where you need to leverage the skills, expertise, and competence of the protection cluster to generate the evidence for you. And third and finally, all levels and angles of our work on protection are vital. Advocating publicly without engaging in closed-door discussions is unlikely to deliver progress. Likewise, developing strategic visions and statements without implementing them operationally is indeed futile. So, panelists, these are some of the quick top-line messages that I would like to share with the colleagues in terms of our experiences.
Eugene, thank you so much for a very comprehensive answer, and an answer that comes from your real experience in the South Sudan context. I heard you talk about the implementation, not just a strategy, but really putting it in practice, and then going through the different parts of it, the role of the protection cluster, the advocacy, the timing, the tone, the message. It's really a multifaceted approach, and most importantly, requiring leadership and requiring the courage to be able to put in the right context, in the right words, and a proactive approach to really be able to address the issues that we all know that these issues are not going to go away. Therefore, they do require a proactive approach and a thoughtful approach to put it forward within that context. I'm going now to be taking questions that we received live. And Eugene, there is a question we got again on South Sudan, which really brings a question related to a concern on gender, in particular sexual gender-based violence in the Southern Sudan context. And the question I have is, what did you find is the best way to really be able to take this, in particular the GBV issues, forward in order to ensure better prevention, better response, a more common approach of the humanitarian family in tackling and dealing with these very sensitive issues? Eugene, over to you.
Thank you, Panos. Indeed, sexual and gender-based violence has been, and it's a huge issue here. Rape has been a huge issue throughout the conflict, and women and girls are exposed to the risk of violence, essentially on a daily basis when carrying out basic daily activities. We as a country team have endeavored to respond maximally, but we do face huge logistical challenges. There's also a deficit in terms of service provision, and we also have to contend with a cultural stigma associated with sexual violence. Although that despite the challenges that we face, this is an issue that we have prioritized, and we are now attempting to tackle head-on at all levels and all angles. And here, let me say, during and after the eruption of violence in July this year, it became apparent that sexual violence against women has been rampant, and we took actions at multiple levels to seek to address this. First is at the strategic level. We immediately, given the importance we attach to this subject, we immediately added sexual violence as a standing agenda item to our HCT agenda. Then, second, we invited UNFPA as the GBV sub-cluster lead to join the Humanitarian Country Team when it came to discussions on this specific agenda item. And then we identified concrete actions that we thought would make a difference in the short term, advocating extensively with a mission to increase patrols in areas where women were at heightened risk. And we knew this because of the work done by our protection cluster colleagues. And we also strongly advocated for UNMISS, the mission, to implement food patrols. At the operational level, the protection cluster worked very hard in producing and in distributing referral cards so that survivors will know where to get services. And the GBV sub-cluster partners stepped up provision of services to survivors, in particular in the POC sites, whilst our protection cluster partners helped to discreetly and appropriately identify those who then needed services. In addition to this, we also engaged extensively in advocacy, both behind the scenes and publicly, to call for an end to the violations. And we did this with the government at the highest level. We also did this by leveraging the donor community to bolster pressure on this important subject. And behind the scenes discussions, we also undertook discussions behind the scenes with armed actors to urge compliance with IHL. And finally, we now know that sexual violence and gender-based violence is a systemic issue, deep within society, deeply rooted within society. So, taking advantage of my resident coordinator hat, we've worked with UNFPA in the lead to develop a comprehensive joint program to look into priority medium and long-term actions that will help prevent and address GBV. We're doing this because we believe that we don't have to just deal with the consequences. We need to deal with the underlying factors. So we are looking to implement this joint program as a complement to the immediate humanitarian response that presently is ongoing on on sexual and gender-based violence. Thank you so much, Panos. Over to you.
Thank you, Eugene. Again, a sensitive question and sensitive issue in many of the operations. One sees often this dilemma of how to address it in an environment so that it really advances and it helps forward to come up with the response, with the advocacy, with the funding, with the plan that really supports gender GBV issue in operations, and one sees this both in conflict or in natural disaster situation, which requires a particular thoughtful approach. Colleagues, there's about 20 minutes left to the webinar, and I have a number of questions in front of me. I'll do my best to take as many as possible, and I'm going very quickly first to Volker. Volker, one of our listeners sent a question to say, who has the prime role to advise the humanitarian coordinator on protection issues? Is it the protection cluster lead agency? Is it OCHA? Is it both together? How about the HCT? Isn't it the HCT that should deliberate and come up with the one or two issues? How do you make it happen, and who really leads and supports the humanitarian coordinator at the field level? Volker.
Well, thank you, Panos. Best practice would indicate that obviously the protection cluster has to provide the analysis, has to develop the options. But it includes then a discussion, especially for the most critical issues, within the humanitarian country team. And this can be sometimes, if the issues are very complex, there could be a combination of very good staff from within the agencies, NGO participants, OCHA, and trying to work through these issues that the protection cluster has identified, and obviously with the protection expertise that the cluster should provide. I think it's a collective effort on the really critical issues to work together as a team in order to find the answers that are often very, very complex and sensitive. Over to you.
Thanks, Volker. Loud and clear, I think, indeed, the collective wisdom, using the protection clusters analysis to bring it up to this one or two issue and having a position. So the cluster lead agency, OCHA, NGOs, UN, that's really quite crucial. Eugene, I'm going to ask you a question we got from one of our listeners. And the question is, protection is often seen as political by governments, by host governments, and also the parties to the conflict. Sometimes we worry that it can compromise access. for operations, how can we balance it between protection and access? We clearly want to take action on protection, but we are worried if we do it, it's really going to limit our operational ability to be close to the people that we're trying to help. Eugene, over to you.
Thank you, Panos. Absolutely. In protection, invariably, and in many instances, certainly seen as political by governments, and there are tremendous sensitivities associated with this. But I must say here that it also needs to be understood that protection of civilians is first and foremost the responsibility, indeed, of governments. We are forced to step in to provide protection services, largely because of the failures of government, and then, of course, of conflict, parties to the conflict. True, dealing with protection can indeed compromise typically delicate access negotiations that we do all the time. But for me, this is where two things become paramount. The first is really smart approaches. We always need to think smart and keep our eye on the ball to fully understand what is it that we want to ultimately achieve. We need to be smart in navigating what I call the protection political landmines. At the same time, we need to be smart navigating the sometimes the difficult and sensitive access landmines that we are confronted with. The second point is that for me, this is really to be able to strike the optimal balance. This is where what I call a whole of a systems approach comes in. The protection cluster doesn't have to work in a complete silo from the access negotiations, and I think the given where I certainly sit as humanitarian coordinator working with the humanitarian country team, we have a bird's eye view. We have a full understanding of the political economy, so we are able to smartly juggle the sensitivities associated with access negotiations, the tricky access negotiations, with the sensitivities, political sensitivities that are associated with protection, and try to find, it will never be a perfect balance, but we try to find the what I call the optimal balance given the context that confronts us at any point in time. It really, in many respects, it is an art, and it's all about smart actions. Thank you, Panos.
Thanks, Eugene, and well put. It's an art, and it's about smart actions and choices and how to make the right steps to really bring a change to people who are in very difficult situation. Colleagues, we have about 15 minutes left. There is a closing poll that has already appeared on your screen. As you're listening, I would like to encourage you to take a minute to give us your feedback on the webinar so far. There's a number of questions that I have in front of me, so I would like to ask both speakers to be as brief as possible so we can take as many as we can. And Volker, the next question that comes in really brings a critical view, and the listener said the protection cluster has really a very important role to play. But to be honest, it's often under-resourced, and also the protection cluster lead agency, UNHCR, at times seems to allocate very little support or resources to the protection cluster, or even broader to the IDP response. And this is in particular if there is a refugee operation, a significant one in country, and the caller talks about DRC, Chad, etc. So the question is, isn't there a bit of a contradiction a little bit between the theory and the practice, and how really to ensure that proper attention support is given, in particular on IDP situations, to the protection cluster and to the way forward? Volker, what are your thoughts?
Thank you very much. I think we have made progress over time, in dedicating much more resources to especially the leadership of protection clusters. We have also within UNHCR internally issued now and followed this over the last couple of years an operational footprint for IDP operations in particular, meaning that we want to be a bit more predictable when it comes to what it is that we as UNHCR have to do, both in terms of our coordination responsibilities, but also in terms of our operational footprint. And we have seen over the last 2 years a certain realignment of this, which helps us then dedicate the resources, obviously, more to those areas where we have direct responsibilities. But I think I would encourage those that have identified resource needs that they bring this to our attention. I would also say, in particular, to the Global Protection Cluster and to UNHCR, to make sure that we can meet these demands as much and within the resources that we have, but also to make sure that within humanitarian response plans, protection staffing is properly provided for. Because what we sometimes see is that the coordination side doesn't get the attention that it deserves. So it is important to flag these issues, both to us, to the Global Protection Cluster, but also within the humanitarian response plan. Over to you, Panos.
Thanks, Volker. So indeed, bringing the issues forward and trying to see where and how to balance it will really be a crucial one. Eugene, I'm going to take the next question. Actually, I'm going to combine a couple of questions, given the fact we have so many and we have about 10 minutes left. I see huge interest on this conversation with many of you really sending us so many questions. So it's a multifaceted question, Eugene. So the first one is, how did you develop the Humanitarian Country Teams protection strategy? Practically, how did you do it to bring it from the cluster to the ATT? If you can give us an example. And then how did you ensure as Humanitarian Coordinator that protection is mainstreamed across all clusters? How did you make sure that wash, shelter, health, food had taken into consideration the protection vulnerabilities and operationalize, put practical steps to the mainstreaming of protection into the work? And then the third part of the question is really a bit of a desperate one, I have to say. Another colleague says, to be honest, although we seem to be making little progresses on a day-to-day protection work, after a while we almost feel like we go back to zero. Really, it feels as if we haven't moved much, and still the same challenges, the same situation goes round and round. How do you deal with this kind of hopeless situation, what appears as hopeless situation at times? Eugene, over to you.
Thank you, Panos. I'll just give you some quick top lines because these are really very, very complex questions indeed. How did we do it in terms of formulation of the strategy? Of course, the anchor for formulating, the technical anchor for formulating the strategies is the protection cluster, where they did a lot of analytical work around analyzing the protection crisis in South Sudan. We were able to set a vision, objectives. We looked at underlying principles. We looked at complementary roles to ensure protection, and here looking at coordination with the mission, coordination with the UN country team within the framework of that, formulating the strategy. Also clearly looking at a framework for monitoring and evaluating progress over time. Also key protection threats, etc., and action plans to achieve it. So all these concrete technical and analytical work done under the leadership by the protection cluster and under their leadership. Then, of course, this is then escalated to the level of the HCT. Then we have goes to the intercluster working group. Then it comes to the HCT. Then we have comprehensive discussions around this. We make sure that all different sub-constituencies, if you like, within our humanitarian country team able to feed into this, so that at the end of the day, we have a product that has the buy-in, indeed, of the entire constituency. Because remember, once you have the protection strategy, that becomes truly the hook, as I said earlier on, and the anchor for all our protection work. On mainstreaming, again, the leadership sits within the protection cluster. There are the gurus. On this, we have developed a mainstreaming toolkit, which has really helped us with our mainstreaming work, both in the context of the HRP formulation and also in the context of all other cluster work. And the mainstreaming tool and the resources that we have in the protection cluster become a resource, to support other clusters. And indeed, in the formulation of the HRP, it helps us be able to do the mainstreaming. On the third point, which I think it's a very profound question, protection work certainly is hard, and it is complex. I think it's also important that in some context we better calibrate our ambitions in terms of what we can achieve in the short term. My own sense is that in most instances, the results that we're going to be able to achieve are going to have to be incremental in nature. But the important thing here is that we can't allow negative energies to hold us back. We cannot be deflated, because this is our mission. This is our mission to protect those in need. It's our mission to provide services to those who require services. So for me personally, it is not okay if we are not making progress. It is not okay. Even if through our efforts we are able to save one life, I think it is worth the effort and it is worth the investment. But finally, let me just say that what we need to place right and center in our work is the direction of movement. Are we making progress over time? If we are not, where are the blockages? How can we deal with these blockages? But the bottom line is that we always have to continue to persevere, because this indeed is our mission. Thank you, panels.
Thanks indeed, Eugene. Maintaining our purpose, our vision, our mission, our focus, and keeping on making steps forward. I think we all agree it's really vital. I'm going to be going through the last round of questions. And Volker, we have another question from a colleague who says, really nice to hear what you're saying, guided by the principle. I feel inspired, but let me tell you the reality in my operation. I work in a country where the resident coordinator, humanitarian coordinator, to be honest, really is reluctant to address difficult protection issues with the authorities. And on top of that, also the cluster lead agency rep is also concerned about upsetting the authorities and really raising issues which are vital for protection and for protection priorities. And also in that country, there's also refugees, and there is a tendency that becomes more important more than anything else. So the caller is asking for advice, how really to move forward in an environment where there is a reluctant leadership, a reluctancy, or perhaps on the approach in terms of how to take and tackle sensitive protection issues. Volker, over to you.
I think first of all, it is extremely important for those who work on protection to ensure that we do the analysis, that we provide the options and recommendations to the RC, HC, UN country teams, and to make sure that these options are actionable, that we actually provide concrete recommendations. I mean, I was mentioning in one particular case in Syria, for example, where we were faced with a very, very difficult situation of humanitarian evacuations out of besieged areas. And it was really important that we then develop minimum standards under which these could take place, because otherwise, and by showing this to the UN country team, that it could otherwise be instrumentalized and politicized within a very complex context, this was important to show the advantages of coming together around addressing critical protection issues. And I think that's the type of thing you need to, it's really the art of persuasion. I think Eugene said it's the art of protection. Well, that's also sometimes internally within our own institutions that we need to do. But please also call on us, call on the GPC, call on ways and means to engage. For UNHCR representatives, I sent out earlier this year a guidance note, what we expect from UNHCR representatives in terms of ensuring that they become the voice of protection within UN country teams and also the voice of the protection cluster. So this is an important responsibility. We have followed up with reps and we will continue to do so. So I think you need to have continued engagement. You need to make the arguments. You need to make succinct, pithy arguments to convince them. So it's really the art of persuasion. And if you need help, let us know. Thank you, Panos.
Thanks, Volker. I'm going to move very quickly back to Eugene. We have one more set of questions for each speaker. Eugene, the question we got of one of the callers is about the integrated nature of the mission. You spoke about it, and of course in South Sudan, the peacekeeping and the integrated mission having a protection within its mandate, protection of civilians. So the caller is asking, how do you put together the peacekeeping, the integrated mission protection strategy and protection of civilians approach with the humanitarian protection strategy and work? Do you firewall them? Is it a different role, different mandate? How do you put it forward in a practical way? Over to you, Eugene.
Thank you, Panos. Very interesting question. I mean, since I've been here in South Sudan, there is something I've learned, which is I hear, given where the strategic part of the house that I sit, I hear we talk a lot about humanitarian space, and then on the other side, I hear a lot about peacekeeping space, and what I always remind colleagues is that there is a place where humanitarian space and peacekeeping space seem to come together, and that is the protection space. So when it comes to the protection space, this is a space where we do have a common objective as peacekeepers and indeed as humanitarian actors. And within the peacekeeping space, we truly need to bring our comparative advantages to bear to deliver results for the people that we, peacekeepers and humanitarians, are here to serve. And when it comes to the peacekeeping space, I think the protection space, 2 or 3 things are important. One, it's truly joint reflections, joint analysis, and exchange of information. That becomes important. It becomes important because at the end of the day, whatever strategies we do have need to talk to each other to enable us maximally have impact on the people that we are here certainly to serve. The second thing that I think for me is important is, I call it the software. It's the relationship issue. It's the relationship, because within the protection space, we need to make sure that we don't develop a toxic relationship that polarizes us. So we need constructive dialogue, we need constructive engagement, and whilst we can't act as one in all instances because of our different DNA, we need within the protection space to try and act indeed as if we were one. Because at the end of the day, we want to deliver common objectives, which is protecting the people who are in need of our services. Thank you, Panos.
Thank you, Eugene. Thanks for your feedback and really in this question, particularly our integrated missions and how to get it right. Colleagues, I'm afraid we have come to the end of this webinar. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you who have joined us from different parts of the world. I hope you found it useful, practical. I hope at the end of it you came out with some specific steps that you can take to your own operation and put in practice, and what often is really, as Volker and both Eugene were saying, difficult questions requiring leadership, requiring courage, requiring really to find the right balance to move forward while working with the humanitarian country team. I'd like to thank in particular the speakers, Volker Turk, Assistant High Commissioner for Refugees Protection at UNHCR. I would also like to thank Eugene Owusu, DSRSG, Humanitarian Coordinator, Resident Coordinator in South Sudan. Really, thank you both for the richness of the answers, your reflective approach, and your practical also and real-life examples that you gave to all of us. As I said at the beginning, in this webinar, there will be a summary note that will come out with the practical steps, your thoughts. It's going to be also, the recording would be available online for colleagues who would want to listen to it again. So thank you very much, and wish you all a good end of the day. Bye-bye.